When I set out for Vancouver Island that summer of 1990, I was desperate for a break. The city had worn me down, and the idea of being alone, surrounded by nature, sounded like exactly what I needed. I found this little spot near the coast where the forest met the ocean. My trailer, parked in a small clearing, became my sanctuary, a place where I could finally breathe. The days were peaceful. I spent them hiking along misty trails, exploring rocky beaches, and just soaking in the quiet. Felt like I'd finally found the solitude I was looking for. The island was wild, untouched in a way that made me feel small, but in a good way. It was just me in the wilderness, with no one else around. But as the sun dipped behind the trees and the shadows stretched longer, something shifted. Peace I felt during the day started to slip away, replaced by an odd unease. The quiet, which had been so calming, began to feel different. Heavy, almost too quiet. Kind of silence that makes you notice every little sound, like the creak of a branch or the rustle of leaves. It was subtle at first, but enough to make me look over my shoulder a few times. The first time I heard the footsteps, I thought I was imagining things. It was late, and I was sitting by the campfire, just watching the flames dance. The night had grown colder, and a chill breeze started to weave through the trees. That's when I heard it. A soft crunch of leaves, like someone stepping lightly just beyond the firelight. I froze, straining to hear. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, something harmless. But my heart was pounding, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Then, the whispers began. It was so faint at first, just a murmur that I could almost dismiss as the wind. But it wasn't the wind. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once, surrounding me in a way that made my skin crawl. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the darkness, but the beam only caught the outlines of twisted trees and thick underbrush. Nothing was there, or at least nothing I could see, but the feeling of being watched was so strong, it was like a weight pressing down on me. Every instinct told me to pack up and leave, but I stayed, trying to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. But deep down, I knew something was out there, lurking just beyond the edge of the light, watching and waiting. The unease I felt only grew stronger as the night wore on. The whispers seemed to get closer, more insistent, like they were trying to tell me something. I could barely make out the words, just a soft, urgent hissing that sent shivers down my spine. Every time I tried to focus on the sound, it would slip away, leaving me more on edge. I kept the flashlight in my hand, shining it around the campsite every few minutes. But no matter where I pointed the light, all I saw were shadows and trees. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond my reach. The night felt alive, like the forest itself was closing in on me. I decided to check the trailer, hoping that maybe I was just tired and getting inside would help me calm down. But as I stood up, I heard it again. Footsteps, louder this time, like someone was moving quickly through the underbrush. I spun around, pointing the flashlight toward the sound, but there was nothing, just darkness. My heart raced, and I felt a wave of dread wash over me. I tried to convince myself that it was still just an animal, maybe a bear, but I knew better. There was something out there, something that didn't belong, and it was getting closer. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and I realized I wasn't just scared. I was terrified. In a panic, I grabbed my phone, desperate to call for help. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock it. But when I looked at the screen, my heart sank. No signal. I tried moving around, hoping to catch just one bar, but it was useless. I was completely cut off, alone in the middle of nowhere, with no way to reach anyone. The fear that had been gnawing at me all night turned into full-blown terror. I rushed inside the trailer, slamming the door behind me and locking it tight. My breathing was ragged, and my mind raced as I tried to figure out what to do. I pulled the blinds down on the windows, but I couldn't help peeking out, hoping and dreading to see something. The trailer felt like a fragile cocoon, barely keeping the outside world at bay. Every creak, every rustle of leaves outside sent me into a panic, convinced that something was out there, right at the edge of the light. The whispers had stopped, but the silence was worse. It was thick, heavy, pressing down on me like a weight. I backed into a corner, clutching the flashlight like it was a lifeline. My eyes darted around the small space, looking for anything that could help me. But what was I even up against? A ghost? An animal? Something worse? I didn't know, and that terrified me even more. Then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, a scream tore through the night. It was raw, primal, filled with so much fear and pain that it made my blood run cold. I froze, too scared to even breathe. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the scream stopped, leaving the night in an even more deafening silence. As the first light of dawn finally crept through the trees, I heard the distant sound of engines. My heart pounded in my chest as I rushed to the window, barely daring to hope. A group of rescuers, drawn by my frantic calls, had finally found me. I flung open the door and stumbled out, my legs barely able to carry me. When they saw me, their faces shifted from determination to concern. I must have looked like a wreck, wild-eyed, trembling, barely able to speak. They helped me into one of their trucks, and I collapsed in the seat, trying to catch my breath. The adrenaline was wearing off, and all I felt now was an overwhelming sense of exhaustion. As we drove away, I tried to explain what happened, but the words came out jumbled, almost incoherent. They listened, though, not dismissing a single word. When we reached town, I was taken to a small clinic. As they checked me over, the locals talked quietly among themselves, their voices low and serious. I overheard bits and pieces, stories about the island, old legends, tales of restless spirits that haunted the woods. They spoke of people who had vanished, of strange sounds that echoed through the trees at night. I didn't want to believe any of it, but the fear in their voices matched what I had felt out there, alone in the dark. When they finally let me go, I couldn't get off the island fast enough. The moment I was back in the city, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The unease lingered. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those shadows dancing at the edge of my vision, heard that scream echoing in the back of my mind. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that I brought something back with me, that a piece of that night will always be with me. Vancouver Island was supposed to be a place of solitude and peace, but instead it became a nightmare I can't forget. Some mysteries I've learned are better left undisturbed. When I first decided to head up to the remote wilderness of northern Wyoming, it was supposed to be my escape. Life had been hectic, and I needed a break from everything. Just me, my trailer, and the quiet embrace of nature. I found this secluded spot surrounded by towering pines, where the only sounds were the whispering wind and the occasional rustle of wildlife. It was perfect. My own little sanctuary far from the noise of the world, where I could finally breathe again. I set up camp near a cluster of trees that provided just enough cover to make me feel hidden from the rest of the world. The air was crisp, the sky a vast canvas of stars that seemed endless. It was peaceful in a way that felt almost surreal, like I had stepped out of my life and into a postcard. This was exactly what I needed, a place to clear my head and find some solitude. Every evening I'd sit by the fire, letting the warmth seep into my bones as I stared up at the night sky. Flames crackled softly, and the smell of burning wood mixed with the fresh scent of pine. It was in these quiet moments that I felt truly alive, like I was reconnecting with something primal and raw. The wilderness had a way of stripping everything else away, leaving just you and the elements. There was another camper not too far from me, a guy named Luca. We hadn't talked much, just exchanged a few friendly nods when we passed each other. He kept to himself, mostly, and his dog, Max, was always by his side. They seemed like a good pair, both quiet and unassuming, fitting right into the peaceful solitude of the place. But that first night, as I sat by the fire, I couldn't shake a feeling, a sense that the quiet was just a little too deep, that the darkness around me was watching. I brushed it off as my mind playing tricks on me. After all, that's what I came here for, right? To be alone with my thoughts, to let the wilderness do its thing and cleanse my spirit. So I let the fire burn low and eventually headed into my trailer, ready to let the night take me. But something about that quiet stuck with me, a nagging whisper at the back of my mind that I couldn't quite ignore. The next evening, just as I was getting comfortable by the fire again, I heard something that made me freeze. A deep, guttural growl. It wasn't the kind of sound you'd expect to hear in the woods, not from any animal I knew of, anyway. My first thought was of Luca and Max. Sounded like it came from the direction of their trailer. Curiosity and concern got the best of me, so I grabbed my flashlight and headed over to check things out. As I approached, the night air felt thick, almost oppressive, like something was weighing it down. When I reached Luca's trailer, I noticed that Max was inside, huddled in a corner, trembling. That dog, usually so calm and steady, was now a nervous wreck, whining softly like he was terrified of something. The inside of the trailer was a mess. Luca's radio lay on the floor, shattered into pieces that looked like they'd been twisted and crushed. It didn't make any sense. Who or what could have done that? My pulse quickened as I looked around, but Luca was nowhere to be found. The only clue was his flashlight, lying on the ground just outside the trailer, beam pointing straight into the woods, as if he'd dropped it in a hurry. I stared into the dark forest, but all I saw were shadows, shifting and swaying with the wind. Still, there was this feeling like the trees themselves were watching me, waiting. I called out for Luca, but the only response was the rustling of leaves and the distant call of some unseen animal. The unease that had been gnawing at me the night before returned, only stronger, more insistent. Part of me wanted to turn around, get back to the safety of my trailer, and pretend I hadn't seen any of it. But the other part, the one that wasn't ready to leave a man alone out there, pushed me to keep going. I couldn't just ignore that something wasn't right. So, I did the only thing that made sense at the time. I grabbed Luca's flashlight and stepped into the woods, calling his name, hoping against hope that he'd just wandered off and was somewhere nearby, safe. But deep down, I knew this was more than just a casual stroll through the trees. There was something out there, something that didn't belong. As I ventured deeper into the woods, the darkness seemed to close in around me. My flashlight barely cut through it, the beam flickering with every step. The air was thick, and each breath felt like it weighed me down a little more. Every noise seemed amplified. Crunch of leaves underfoot, snap of twigs somewhere off to the side. I kept calling out for Luca, but my voice sounded small, swallowed by the vastness of the forest. It wasn't long before the fear started creeping in, that primal fear that tells you you're not alone. Trees loomed tall and silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, something just out of sight. The deeper I went, the stronger it became, like a pair of eyes boring into the back of my neck. I spun around more than once, convinced I'd see something lurking in the shadows, but there was nothing, just the trees and the darkness. But the forest was different now, twisted in a way that made it hard to recognize. Every direction looked the same, and I couldn't tell if I was making progress or just wandering in circles. The paths I thought I knew so well during the day had become a labyrinth of shifting shadows, and the silence was deafening. My heart pounded in my chest, louder than any sound around me. I kept moving, more out of desperation than any real sense of direction. The thought of turning back crossed my mind more than once, but the idea of leaving Luca out there, wherever he was, kept me going. The unease had turned into full-blown dread, a sinking feeling that something was terribly wrong, that Luca wasn't just lost. Then, out of nowhere, I heard it, a low, rumbling growl, like the one I'd heard before. Only this time, it was much closer. I froze, my blood running cold, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. The trees around me felt alive, like they were closing in, and I realized just how alone I was out there. No one would hear me if I screamed. For what felt like hours, I stood there, too afraid to move, too afraid to stay. The growl faded into the distance. Fear didn't. It stayed with me, crawling under my skin, making it hard to think straight. I knew I had to find Luca. But more than that, I knew I had to get out of those woods before whatever was out there decided to find me first. After what felt like an eternity, I decided to turn back. My instincts screamed at me to leave the woods behind, but I couldn't shake the nagging guilt over Luca. I hadn't come this far just to abandon him. Yet every step back towards the campsite felt like a surrender to some unseen force, like I was leaving him behind to face whatever nightmare was lurking out there alone. As I retraced my steps, the forest seemed even more disorienting than before. The path I thought I was following twisted and turned in ways that made no sense, as if the woods were shifting around me. My flashlight flickered again, and I cursed under my breath, banging it against my palm. The beam steadied, but it did little to pierce the suffocating darkness. Suddenly I heard something. Faint at first, but unmistakable. It was a voice, distant and strained, calling my name. My heart leapt. "Luca?" I shouted, my voice cracking from the fear and relief mixing together. The voice called again, closer this time, and I started running towards it, stumbling over roots and branches in my haste. But as I got closer, something felt off. The voice was familiar, but there was an unnatural echo to it, like it was being distorted through a tunnel. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I slowed my pace, uncertainty gnawing at me. Then the voice called out again, but this time it wasn't my name. It was a word I couldn't quite make out, something guttural and harsh, and the sound sent a jolt of terror through me. I stopped dead in my tracks, straining to listen. But the voice had gone silent. The only sound was my own ragged breathing and the blood pounding in my ears. Panic surged through me as I realized I might have been lured deeper into the woods, drawn by something that wasn't Luca at all. I spun around, trying to find my bearings. But everything looked the same, just an endless sea of trees and shadows. My flashlight flickered again, and this time it went out completely. I was plunged into darkness, the kind that makes you feel like the whole world has vanished around you. Fear gripped me, stronger than ever, and I fought the urge to scream. I knew I had to stay calm, but the darkness was pressing in on me, suffocating, and all I wanted to do was run. I fumbled with the flashlight, shaking it desperately, but it was dead. My hands were trembling so badly I nearly dropped it. That's when I felt it. Presence behind me, close enough that I could almost feel its breath on my neck. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing, and I knew, without a doubt, something was there. I didn't dare turn around. I couldn't. Instead, I started to walk, slow and deliberate, praying that whatever it was wouldn't follow. I kept moving, step by agonizing step, trying to stay calm, but the fear was overwhelming. My heart raced, and every instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew better. Running would only trigger whatever was behind me if it hadn't already. The darkness seemed to press in closer, thick and impenetrable, as if it was alive, wrapping itself around me. I could feel it, the presence, just out of reach, stalking me silently. The woods were deathly quiet now, as if the entire forest was holding its breath, watching this twisted game of cat and mouse unfold. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being toyed with, like whatever was out there was enjoying my terror. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Could it be Luca? Had something happened to him, something that turned him into this? But that voice, the way it had distorted, didn't feel human. It was as if the woods themselves had twisted it into something malevolent, something that wore Luca's voice like a mask. I didn't know how long I walked. It felt like hours. My legs were shaking and my breath came in ragged gasps. I was lost in the woods, with no sense of direction, no light, and no hope. I was just stumbling blindly, praying I didn't trip or fall, because I knew if I did, it would be over. Whatever was behind me would pounce. Then, out of nowhere, I saw a flicker of light ahead. It was faint, but it was there, cutting through the suffocating darkness like a lifeline. My heart leapt, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I had a shred of hope. Maybe it was my campsite. Maybe I was finally close to getting out of these cursed woods. But as I moved closer, that hope started to wither. The light wasn't from a campfire, and it wasn't from any trailer or flashlight. It was something else, something wrong. The glow was unnatural, a sickly pale light that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. I felt my stomach churn with dread, but I was too far gone to turn back now. I had to see. As I stepped into the clearing, I saw it, an old, weathered totem standing in the center, its carved face twisted in a grotesque expression. The light was coming from the base of the totem, seeping out of the ground like a foul mist. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the ground seemed to pulse beneath my feet, alive with something dark and ancient. Then I heard it again. The voice, but this time it wasn't calling my name. It was chanting, low and rhythmic, in a language I couldn't understand but felt deep in my bones. The sound reverberated through the clearing, growing louder, more insistent, until it was all I could hear. I knew I had to leave. Whatever this place was, whatever that totem represented, it wasn't meant for me. I backed away slowly, my eyes never leaving the twisted face carved into the wood until I was far enough to turn and run. I didn't care if it followed me, just needed to get away. When I finally burst out of the woods, the first rays of dawn were breaking over the horizon. My trailer was there, campfire reduced to embers, and the world seemed normal again. But I knew better. Nothing would ever be normal after what I'd seen. I packed up and left that morning, not even bothering to check for Luca. Deep down, I knew I wouldn't find him. Not in any way that made sense. As I drove away, I didn't look back at the forest. I didn't need to. Whatever was in those woods would stay with me, haunting the edges of my mind, a shadow I could never outrun. And as the miles stretched out before me, the memory of that chanting voice, the sickly light, and the grotesque face of the totem lingered. A chilling reminder that some places in this world are meant to stay forgotten. Returning to Idaho's wilderness felt like a bittersweet homecoming. My wife and I used to come here every summer, her laughter echoing through the trees, the crackling campfire casting warm light on her face. It's been 2 years since she passed. The memories are still as vivid as ever. That's why I decided to come back. I thought maybe, just maybe, being here could help me reconnect with her in some way, or at least find some peace. The drive was long, 7 hours of winding roads that cut through valleys and hugged the edges of towering peaks. A kind of journey that gives you too much time to think. When I finally arrived at the campsite, there were a few other tents scattered around, which I found oddly comforting. It was reassuring to know that I wasn't completely alone out here, even if solitude was what I'd originally sought. But as I started setting up camp, something tugged at me. Quiet restlessness, like the forest was watching me, waiting for something. I can't explain it, but I felt drawn away from the other campers. I needed to find a spot where I could be truly alone. So I packed up and hiked deeper into the woods until I found a secluded area surrounded by ancient pine. Felt right. Quiet, peaceful, isolated. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the familiar scent of pine needles filled the air. I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, trying to let go of everything that had been weighing me down. The warmth of the fire was comforting, but that restlessness still lingered, making it hard to relax. I couldn't shake the feeling that the night held something more than just the usual sounds of the forest. Just as I was starting to drift off, the night shattered with a scream, a sound so piercing and raw that it jolted me upright. My heart pounded in my chest as I scanned the darkness. Straining to see through the trees, the forest, once so quiet, now felt alive with tension. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig seemed amplified, echoing in the silence that followed that scream. I grabbed my flashlight, hands trembling, and pointed it into the woods. The beam cut through the darkness. All it showed were the twisted shapes of trees, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. And then, just at the edge of the light, I saw it. Shadow, something that moved too quickly to make out clearly. It darted through the underbrush and vanished as if it had never been there. Panic started to creep in. My first instinct was to call for help, but when I reached for my phone, I realized there was no signal out here. Of course, I knew that when I came out this far, but now the isolation felt more like a trap than a retreat. I was alone, with no way to reach anyone, and someone was out there. I forced myself to stay calm, to think logically. Maybe it was just an animal, trick of the light, but deep down, I knew that wasn't it. There was something off about the whole situation, something that didn't sit right. I double-checked the campsite, made sure the fire was still burning strong, and tried to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled in my gut. Sleep was out of the question. I sat there, eyes darting around, listening to every sound, every movement in the dark. The hours dragged on, each one feeling longer than the last, and the forest seemed to close in around me, suffocating me with its silence. All I could do was wait for dawn, hoping that whatever was out there wouldn't come any closer. Dawn finally broke, casting a gray light over the forest that did little to chase away the unease that had clung to me all night. I packed up my camp as quickly as I could, my movements mechanical and hurried. The remnants of last night's terror were still fresh in my mind, and I was eager to get out of the area. I decided to head into the woods to see if I could find any clue about the strange scream I'd heard. The forest looked different in the daylight, less menacing but still haunting in its own way. The trees seemed taller, their branches thick and tangled, casting long shadows on the forest floor. As I wandered deeper into the woods, I stumbled upon something that made my heart sink. It was an old campsite, abandoned for who knows how long. Torn fabric from a tent fluttered in the breeze, and there were charred remains of a fire pit, the ashes still warm. Next to it lay a weathered journal, pages yellowed with age. I picked up the journal, feeling a chill run down my spine as I flipped through it. The entries were disjointed and frantic, filled with vague references to an ancient presence in the woods, something malevolent that preyed on those who ventured too deep. Phrases like "shadow among the pines" and "eternal darkness" jumped out at me, each one adding to the sense of dread that was already weighing me down. It was clear that whoever had written this journal had been terrified, and their fear was palpable. They spoke of disappearing without a trace, of sightings of a shadowy figure, and of an inescapable feeling of being watched. Felt like a warning, a message from someone who had encountered the same horrors I was now grappling with. I had to know more. Couldn't just ignore this. So I headed back to the nearby town, hoping to find some answers. The locals were reluctant to speak at first, but as I pressed them, they began to open up. They talked in hushed tones about a spectral figure that roamed the mountains, said to exact vengeance on those who trespassed too far into its domain. Rumors of disappearances and strange phenomena were common. People spoke of shadows moving on their own, whispers in the dark that no one could explain. Fear in their voices was palpable, collective unease that hinted at a truth too disturbing to confront openly. I left the town with a heavy heart, the stories and warnings echoing in my mind. The mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks shrouded in mist, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something ancient and sinister lurked within them. My own encounter had only scratched the surface of whatever was hiding in those woods, and I couldn't help but feel that I had narrowly escaped something far worse. As I drove away, I glanced back at the forest one last time, its vast expanse a silent testament to the mysteries and horrors that lay hidden within. I knew then that some secrets were best left undisturbed, and that the wilderness had its own way of keeping its darkest truths buried. Returning to my trailer that morning was a blur of frantic thoughts and deep unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even as I tried to focus on packing up and leaving. Every sound in the forest seemed amplified, each rustle of leaves or snap of a twig a potential threat. I was desperate to escape the clutches of the wilderness, but a gnawing curiosity kept me rooted to the spot. After I'd packed up the essentials, I ventured back into the woods, driven by a mix of dread and determination. I wanted to see if I could uncover more about the old campsite I'd found. The journal had stirred something deep within me, a need to understand the darkness that seemed to permeate the forest. As I navigated through the tangled undergrowth, the forest felt oppressive, almost as if it were trying to keep me from discovering its secret. Every step seemed to echo loudly, and I found myself constantly checking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something, or someone, lurking just out of sight. The further I went, the more the forest seemed to close in around me. Trees were dense, their branches weaving together to form a natural barrier. I stumbled upon more signs of past campers, discarded gear, remnants of old fires, and occasional scraps of clothing. Each new discovery made my skin crawl, the sense of abandonment and fear growing stronger with every step. Eventually I came across another abandoned campsite, this one even older and more decrepit than the first. Fire pit was overgrown with weeds, and a rusted, half-collapsed tent was barely visible beneath a thick layer of pine needle. This site felt different, more sinister, as though it had been untouched for decades. Near the site, I found another journal, similar in condition to the first, but filled with even more frantic entries. The writings detailed terrifying encounters with a shadowy figure that seemed to stalk the forest, presence marked by a sudden drop in temperature and an overwhelming sense of dread. The author wrote about hearing guttural growls and seeing fleeting shadows, their words almost pleading for someone to understand their terror. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read through the journal. It was clear that whoever had been here had experienced something far beyond normal fear. Their descriptions matched what I had heard and felt. Growls, the shadows, the inexplicable sense of being watched. My hands trembled as I put the journal back in its place. The forest seemed to pulse with an unseen malevolence, and the shadows between the trees seemed to shift and writhe with a life of their own. I knew I had to leave, but a part of me was reluctant to turn my back on this dark mystery. The oppressive atmosphere weighed heavily on me as I made my way back to the trailer. The sense of being pursued was almost unbearable, and every time I looked over my shoulder, the forest seemed even darker, more foreboding. The feeling of being watched never left me, even as I drove away from the campsite. The drive back was long and silent. The stories and the journals weighed heavily on my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the wilderness had left a mark on me. As the landscape changed, and the forest receded into the distance, I tried to convince myself that it was all just a series of coincidences and overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew that something ancient and malevolent still lurked in those woods, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to wander too close. As I drove away from the wilderness, my thoughts churned with the unsettling experiences I just endured. The forest's oppressive weight seemed to cling to me, even as the trees receded in the rearview mirror. I tried to focus on the road, to push the creeping sense of dread to the back of my mind. The eerie memories refused to fade. Back in town, I sought out locals to try and piece together more about the strange occurrences in the forest. The community seemed guarded, their conversations laced with apprehension when I mentioned the shadowy figure and the abandoned campsites. The fear in their eyes was palpable, and I couldn't help but feel that they were hiding something from me. Few locals hinted at old legends, stories about a malevolent presence that haunted the mountains, a spirit that fed on fear and despair. They spoke in hushed tones about inexplicable disappearances and a history of strange phenomena that defied explanation. It became clear that the wilderness I had ventured into was more than just a place of natural beauty. It was a realm steeped in dark folklore and hidden dangers. The whispers of government cover-ups and mysterious vanishings only added to my unease. It seemed that the forest was not just a backdrop for my fears, but a living entity with its own secret. The locals' reluctance to discuss the matter openly spoke volumes about the terror that lay beneath the surface. I left town with a heavy heart, feeling as though I had uncovered something that was never meant to be understood. The mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks shrouded in mist and mystery. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something ancient and primal still lingered in those woods. Force beyond human comprehension, lurking just out of sight. The road stretched ahead, and I glanced back at the silhouette of the forest one last time. A sense of finality settled over me, mixed with a lingering fear that perhaps I had only scratched the surface of a deeper darkness. The wilderness of Idaho had revealed a sliver of its sinister nature, and I was left with a chilling certainty that some mysteries are best left undisturbed. As I continued my journey home, a vast expanse of untouched wilderness seemed to watch me, a silent reminder of the horrors that slumbered beneath the forest canopy. Forest's echoes would haunt me long after I had left its confine, a reminder that not all stories end with the sunrise. Some nightmares are timeless, their shadows eternal, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to wander into their domain. Yellowstone had always been on our bucket list, and when Sarah suggested a camping trip there, we all jumped at the idea. It felt like the perfect escape. Just us, nature, and the thrill of being out in the wild. We packed up the essentials and headed out, eager to leave the everyday grind behind. The drive was long, but the excitement kept us going. When we finally arrived, the sheer beauty of the place took my breath away. Towering pines stretched endlessly into the sky, and the air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine needles and earth. We found a perfect spot near Yellowstone Lake, the water calm and inviting, reflecting the clear blue of the sky. Setting up camp was a breeze. Sarah, being the most organized among us, took charge, directing where the tents should go and how to arrange our little site. Mark, as usual, was cracking jokes, trying to keep things light, while Alex was already talking about the crazy hikes he wanted to do. Emily seemed a bit quieter than usual, her eyes wandering to the trees around us, as if she was searching for something just out of sight. Jake, ever the pragmatist, made sure our campfire was safe and steady before settling down with a satisfied nod. By the time the sun started setting, we had everything in place. The fading light cast a golden hue over the lake, and the forest seemed to hum with life, the distant calls of wildlife adding to the serenity of it all. We gathered around the fire, flames dancing as we laughed and talked about everything and nothing. It was Sarah who first brought up the local legends. She had a knack for storytelling, always knowing how to spin a tale just right. As she spoke of spirits said to haunt the park, the mood around the fire shifted. Mark scoffed, as expected, rolling his eyes at the idea of ghosts in the woods. But Emily didn't laugh. Instead, she stared into the flames, her expression unreadable. "Come on, it's just a story," Mark said, trying to lighten the mood again. But the unease had already settled in, cold draft you couldn't quite shake. That night, as I lay in my tent, listening to the sounds of the forest, I couldn't help but wonder if there was more to Sarah's story than just campfire tales. The rustling leaves outside seemed louder, and the usual comfort of the wilderness felt different, almost watchful. I brushed it off as first-night jitters, but the feeling lingered, making it harder to fall asleep. Little did I know, it was just the beginning. The next day started off like any other camping trip. We woke up to the smell of pine and the distant calls of birds echoing through the forest. The early morning light filtered through the trees, casting a warm glow over our campsite. We spent the day hiking, exploring the trails around Yellowstone, and marveling at the natural beauty that surrounded us. Mark was in his element, cracking jokes and poking fun at anyone who seemed the least bit spooked by the eerie stillness of the forest. Alex, ever the thrill-seeker, kept veering off the path, searching for hidden spots that weren't on the map. Emily stayed close to Sarah and me, her usual confidence replaced by a quiet alertness. She didn't say much, but every so often I'd catch her glancing over her shoulder, as if she expected to see something or someone following us. By the time we made it back to the campsite, we were exhausted but content. We settled around the fire again, the sun dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground. It was then that Alex suggested we go exploring at night. "Come on, guys, where's your sense of adventure?" he teased, grinning as he nudged Mark. "We're in the middle of Yellowstone. Let's see what this place is like after dark." I hesitated, the unease from the night before still gnawing at the back of my mind. But Mark was all in, and even Sarah seemed intrigued by the idea. Emily looked at me, her eyes full of concern, but neither of us wanted to be the ones to chicken out. So we grabbed our flashlights and set off into the woods, the darkness quickly swallowing us up. The forest was a different world at night. The sounds were sharper, the shadows deeper, and the feeling of being watched was almost palpable. Our flashlights cut through the blackness, illuminating the path ahead. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. As we walked, strange noises echoed through the woods, rustling leaves, distant whispers, and the occasional snap of a twig. At first, I thought it was just animals, but the sounds were too deliberate, too rhythmic. Every so often, I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. Just more darkness, more shadows. Emily stayed close to me, her hand occasionally brushing against mine as we walked. She was tense, her eyes darting around, trying to pinpoint the source of the sounds. Mark, on the other hand, was still trying to keep the mood light, cracking jokes and making exaggerated ghost noises. But even he seemed less sure of himself as we ventured deeper into the woods. Then we stumbled upon it, the abandoned cabin. It was hidden deep in the forest, far off any trail we'd seen on the map. The windows were shattered, the door hanging loosely on its hinges, and the whole place radiated an unsettling aura. The air around it felt heavier, thicker, as if the very ground was trying to warn us away. Alex was the first to approach it. "Looks like we found our adventure," he said with a grin, though there was a nervous edge to his voice. He pushed the door open, and it creaked ominously, the sound cutting through the silence like a knife. I didn't want to go inside, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but the others were already moving forward, curiosity getting the better of them. Reluctantly, I followed, my heart pounding in my chest as I stepped over the threshold. The inside of the cabin was worse than I imagined. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, the furniture was decaying, and the walls were lined with cryptic symbols that sent a shiver down my spine. Felt like we had walked into a different time, a place where the normal rules didn't apply. Then Sarah found the diary, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. As she started to read aloud, the air grew colder, and the cabin seemed to groan around us, as if reacting to the words. The story of the family that vanished from this very cabin unfolded, and with each line, the dread in my stomach deepened. By the time she finished, the silence was suffocating. None of us spoke, the reality of our situation sinking in. We needed to get out, but as we turned to leave, the cabin seemed to come alive, the floorboards creaking and the shadows shifting. Panic gripped us as we scrambled for the door, desperate to escape whatever was lurking in that place. But the forest outside was no longer the same. The trees loomed taller, the paths twisted into unfamiliar shapes, and every step felt like it was leading us further into a nightmare. We were lost, and the feeling of being hunted grew stronger with each passing second. It was then that I realized this wasn't just a camping trip anymore. We had crossed a line, and something in those woods didn't want us to leave. We tried to keep our cool as we retraced our steps. The forest had other plans. Trees, once familiar, now seemed to tower over us, their branches intertwining like a cage. Our flashlights flickered, the beams weak against the oppressive darkness that pressed in on us from all sides. The whispers that had started as faint echoes now grew louder, more insistent, like they were surrounding us. Emily was shaking, fear palpable. She kept glancing over her shoulder, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "We need to get out of here," she whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded, swallowing my own fear, trying to think clearly, but it was hard when every shadow seemed to pulse with malevolent intent. "Keep moving," Jake urged, his voice strained but steady. He was always the calm one, the one who kept us grounded, but even he couldn't hide the tension in his tone. "We just need to find the path. We're not far from the campsite," but the path was nowhere to be found. Every turn we took seemed to lead us deeper into the forest's clutches. The ground beneath us felt uneven, like we were walking on something that didn't belong there. My heart raced, a cold sweat forming on my brow as the sense of dread grew heavier with each step. Then, in the distance, we saw it. Faint light flickering through the trees. Relief washed over us, thinking it might be our campsite. We hurried toward it, our pace quickening despite the growing exhaustion. But as we drew closer, our hope quickly turned to horror. It wasn't our campsite. It was another clearing, and at its center stood ancient totems, their carved faces twisted in expressions of agony. Flickering light came from small fires that surrounded the totems, casting long, dancing shadows across the ground. The air was thick with the scent of burning wood and something else, something metallic and foul. Emily gasped, recognizing the symbols etched into the totems. They were the same as the ones we had seen in the cabin, the same ones that were in the diary. She clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin as she whispered, "We need to leave, now." But as we turned to go, the ground beneath us shifted, and a low, guttural sound rumbled through the air. It was as if the forest itself was alive, reacting to our presence, trying to keep us there. Panic surged through me. I could see it mirrored in the eyes of my friends. Jake grabbed my hand, pulling me toward the tree line. "Run!" he shouted, and we bolted, our footsteps pounding against the earth as we fled the clearing. The whispers turned into wails, the shadows in the trees stretching out as if trying to grab us. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead. I didn't dare slow down. We ran blindly through the forest, the trees blurring into a dark mass around us. I could hear Emily crying, Mark muttering to himself in disbelief, and Alex cursing under his breath. The fear was tangible, like a weight pressing down on us, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. But then, through the chaos, I heard Sarah's voice. She was calling out, her voice sharp with urgency. "This way!" She had found something. Faint trail, almost hidden beneath the undergrowth. Without thinking, we followed her, clinging to the hope that it might lead us back to safety. The trail twisted and turned, but it was a path, and that was enough to keep us moving. The sounds of the forest slowly faded, the oppressive feeling lifting as we put distance between us and the clearing. But the fear lingered, a gnawing dread that something was still following us, watching us. When we finally stumbled back into our campsite, the relief was overwhelming. We collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath, our bodies trembling with exhaustion and fear. Fire had died down, and the familiar sight of our tents brought a small measure of comfort. But it wasn't enough to erase the horror of what we had just experienced. No one spoke for a long time. We just sat there, trying to process what had happened, the reality of it sinking in. We had gone looking for adventure, and we had found something far darker than we ever could have imagined. As I sat there, staring into the dying embers of the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was still watching us, that those shadows, those whispers, were still out there, waiting. And I knew, deep down, that we had crossed a line, disturbed something that should have been left alone. We might have made it back to the campsite, but we weren't safe. Not really. And the worst part was, I had no idea what was going to happen next. The air around us was thick with tension, an uneasy silence settling over the campsite as we tried to collect ourselves. The fire was nearly out, casting only faint, flickering shadows that did little to chase away the lingering darkness. I could see the fear in everyone's eyes. Even Jake, who usually kept his cool, was on edge. None of us wanted to admit it, but we were terrified. I looked over at Sarah, who was pacing near the remnants of the fire, her hands shaking as she ran them through her hair. "We shouldn't have gone out there," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. This was a mistake, a huge mistake. Mark, who had been quiet since we got back, finally spoke up. "What the hell was that?" The voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Those symbols, the totems, it's like we stumbled into some kind of nightmare." Emily, still trembling, pulled her knees to her chest and rocked back and forth, her eyes wide with terror. "We need to leave, right now. This place, there's something wrong here, something evil." Alex, usually the most fearless among us, was uncharacteristically subdued, kept glancing over his shoulder as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows at any moment. "Emily's right, we can't stay here. Whatever that was, it's not going to just let us walk away." I nodded, my mind racing as I tried to think of a plan. We were miles from the nearest ranger station, and it was too dark and dangerous to try to navigate the woods at night. Staying here felt just as perilous. "We'll leave at first light," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. "Pack up what we can now. Get some rest if possible, and as soon as the sun comes up, we're out of here." Jake nodded in agreement, though I could tell he was still uneasy. "We need to stay close, keep the fire going as much as possible. Whatever we do, we can't let it catch us off guard." We all moved with a quiet urgency, packing up our gear as quickly as we could. Every rustle in the trees, every snap of a twig sent a jolt of fear through me. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something was out there, just beyond the light of the fire, waiting. Once everything was packed, we huddled around the fire, our backs to each other, trying to keep watch in every direction. But the exhaustion from our frantic run through the forest was catching up to us. My eyelids felt heavy, my mind drifting despite the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. Just as I was starting to nod off, a loud crash echoed through the trees, followed by a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath us. We all jumped to our feet, hearts pounding as we stared into the darkness, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. "What the hell was that?" Alex hissed, his voice barely audible over the pounding of my own heart. "I don't know," Jake whispered back, gripping the handle of his flashlight like a weapon. "But we need to stay calm, stick together." The growling grew louder, closer, and then it stopped. The sudden silence was almost more terrifying than the noise itself. We stood there, frozen, waiting for something to happen. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a shadow moving just beyond the trees, too quick to make out, but unmistakably there. My blood ran cold as I realized that whatever it wasn't alone. More shadows flickered through the trees, circling us, closing in. "Run!" I screamed, not caring about staying quiet anymore. "We have to run." But before we could even move, the fire in front of us flared up violently, as if a gust of wind had blown through, and then extinguished, plunging us into complete darkness. Panic erupted. We scattered in different directions, each of us driven by blind fear. I could hear my friends shouting, their voices filled with terror. The forest swallowed up the sound, muffling everything. I ran as fast as I could, not caring where I was going, just needing to get away from whatever was out there. But no matter how fast I ran, the shadows seemed to follow, whispering my name, taunting me with faint, ghostly voices. I stumbled, my foot catching on a root, and fell hard to the ground. Pain shot through my ankle, but I forced myself to get up, keep moving. As I limped through the trees, I caught a glimpse of something ahead. Another clearing, lit by the faintest light. I pushed myself toward it, my breath coming in ragged gasps, hoping, praying that it would lead to safety. But when I broke through the tree line, what I saw stopped me dead in my tracks. It wasn't safety. It was the totems again, standing tall and menacing in the center of the clearing, their faces twisted in agony, just like before. And surrounding them were more shadows, more of those things, waiting. There was no escape. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Whatever was happening here, whatever curse or force was at work, it wasn't going to let us go. We had disturbed something ancient, something evil, and now it was going to make us pay. Terror gripped me as I backed away, my mind racing for a way out, but deep down, I knew there was none. We were trapped, caught in a nightmare of our own making, and there was no waking up from this. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed with fear, staring at those twisted totems and the shadows that seemed to pulse with life around them. My mind was a blur, desperately trying to make sense of the nightmare I'd stumbled into. But every thought led back to the same terrifying conclusion. We were doomed. Air felt thick, heavy, like it was pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. My heart pounded in my chest, frantic drumbeat that echoed in my ears. I wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but the words caught in my throat, suffocated by the overwhelming dread that had taken hold of me. Suddenly, I heard a faint rustling behind me. I spun around, my flashlight trembling in my hand as I tried to focus on the source of the sound. My heart skipped a beat when I saw Sarah stumbling out of the trees, her face pale and eyes wide with terror. "Sarah," I whispered hoarsely, rushing over to her. "Are you okay? Did you see the others?" She shook her head, her whole body trembling. I don't know where they are. I got separated. I thought I heard something behind me, but when I turned around, there was nothing. Just nothing." I grabbed her by the shoulders, trying to steady both of us. "We have to stay together. We need to find the others and get out of here." She nodded weakly, but I could see the fear in her eyes, the same fear that was gnawing at me. Whatever was out there, whatever had driven us apart, it wasn't done with us yet. We started moving cautiously through the clearing, keeping the totems in our periphery, flashlights flickering as if the batteries were dying. Every step felt like it took us deeper into the darkness, farther away from any hope of escape. As we pushed forward, we heard a muffled cry, a voice we recognized. "Jake?" I shouted, hoping he could hear us. "Jake, where are you?" Cry came again, closer this time, and then, out of the darkness, we saw him. Jake was limping toward us, his face pale and blood smeared on his forehead. Relief flooded through me, but it was quickly overshadowed by the look of sheer panic in his eyes. "They're coming," he gasped, clutching his side as he stumbled closer. "We have to run. Now." I didn't need to be told twice. Grabbing Sarah's hand, we took off, running blindly through the trees, guided only by the desperate need to escape. The shadows seemed to close in around us, their whispers growing louder, more insistent, as if they were feeding off our fear. Branches whipped against my face, tearing at my skin, but I didn't care. All that mattered was putting as much distance between us and whatever was chasing us. I could hear Sarah and Jake panting beside me, their breaths ragged and strained. But no matter how fast we ran, the forest seemed to stretch on endlessly, twisting and turning in ways that made no sense. It was like the trees were moving, shifting to keep us trapped, preventing us from finding our way out. Just when I thought I couldn't run any further, we burst into another clearing. The same clearing with the totems. My heart sank as I realized we had been running in circles, drawn back to this cursed spot. Like moths to a flame, Jake swore under his breath, looking around frantically for any sign of an escape. This can't be happening. We're stuck. We're going to die here. No, I shouted, refusing to give in to the despair that threatened to swallow us whole. We're not going to die. We just have to. Before I could finish, the ground beneath us began to tremble, a low rumble that seemed to come from the very earth itself. Totems loomed over us, their carved faces twisted in silent screams, as the shadows around them began to writhe and twist, taking on horrifying shapes. And then, from the darkness, they emerged. Figures with hollow eyes, their bodies twisted and distorted, as if they were caught between this world and the next. They moved with unnatural speed, closing in on us with every passing second. I felt Sarah's grip tighten on my hand, her nails digging into my skin. "What do we do?" she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we couldn't outrun them, and we couldn't fight them. We were completely at their mercy. Just as I thought all hope was lost, I remembered the circle of fire Jake had made earlier, the only thing that had seemed to keep the darkness at bay. "Jake," I gasped. "The fire. We need to make another circle of fire." Jake's eyes widened as he realized what I was saying. Without hesitation, he pulled out the lighter from his pocket, started flicking it desperately, trying to ignite the dry leaves around us. But the lighter sputtered, flame barely catching before going out again. Come on, he muttered, his hands shaking as he tried again and again. The figures were almost upon us now, their hollow eyes fixated on us with a hunger that made my blood run cold. I could feel the cold breath of the shadows on my neck, the oppressive weight of the darkness closing in around us. And then, just as all seemed lost, a small flame flickered to life, catching on the dry leaves and quickly spreading. Jake moved frantically, using whatever he could find to build the fire into a protective circle around us. As the flames grew higher, the shadows recoiled, hissing and shrieking as they were forced back. Figures that had been closing in on us began to fade, their twisted forms dissolving into the darkness. For a moment it seemed like we had won. Fire had saved us. But deep down, I knew this was only a temporary reprieve. The shadows were still out there, lurking just beyond the light, waiting for their chance to strike again. We huddled together in the center of the circle, our eyes locked on the darkness that surrounded us. None of us spoke, too exhausted and terrified to say anything. All we could do was wait, praying that the fire would hold until dawn, that we could survive the night. As the hours dragged on, fire began to dwindle, flames growing weaker and weaker. I could feel the cold creeping in, the shadows inching closer with every passing second. And then, just when I thought the darkness would consume us, the first light of dawn broke through the trees. The shadows recoiled, retreating into the forest as the sunlight banished them back to whatever hell they had come from. We were alive. We had survived the night. But as we packed up our things and prepared to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. That the darkness was still out there, waiting for its next opportunity to strike. As we drove away from the park, I glanced back at the trees, half expecting to see the shadows lurking there, watching us with their hollow eyes. But there was nothing, just the serene, untouched beauty of Yellowstone. But I knew better. I knew that the park held secrets, ancient and terrible, that it wouldn't hesitate to unleash on anyone foolish enough to disturb them. And I knew that no matter how far we ran, no matter how hard we tried to forget, the shadows would always be with us, lurking just out of sight, waiting for their chance to return. In the summer of 2012, I felt the need to escape the chaos of city life. My name is Marcus Donovan, and I was desperate for a break, a chance to breathe in some fresh air and clear my mind. After searching online, I found the perfect spot, a remote cabin deep in the heart of Aulani National Forest, Pennsylvania. It was old, rustic, and surrounded by towering pines, far away from any signs of civilization. Exactly what I was looking for. I arrived at the cabin with a sense of excitement. The isolation was comforting, almost soothing. The first few days were exactly what I needed. I spent hours wandering along winding trails, fishing at serene lakes, and just soaking in the silence, broken only by the occasional bird call. There was something incredibly peaceful about being so far from everything. On the fourth day, my curiosity got the better of me. The forest had a way of pulling you in, making you want to explore its depths. I found myself following a faint, overgrown path that seemed less traveled, the kind that feels like it's been forgotten by time. The trail led me deeper into the woods, where the trees grew thicker and the air felt different, heavier. After what felt like hours, I stumbled upon a small clearing. At the center was a pristine lake, untouched, almost surreal in its stillness. The sight was mesmerizing. I sat by the water's edge, watching the reflections ripple in the gentle breeze. It was then that something across the lake caught my eye. A tattered backpack, half buried in the mud, as if someone had left it in a hurry. Curiosity got the best of me again, so I made my way through the thick underbrush to get a closer look. As I reached the backpack, a strange feeling washed over me. It was as if the air had turned colder, the silence around me growing more oppressive. Kneeling down, I hesitated before unzipping it, not sure what I would find. Inside, I found the usual, some scraps of old food wrappers, torn map, but what really caught my attention was a weathered journal. The name Emily Hart was scrawled on the cover in faded ink. I flipped through the pages, and what I read made my blood run cold. The entries were filled with notes about eerie occurrences, strange whispers at night, an unsettling feeling of being watched, like the forest itself was alive and aware of her presence. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was as if the journal was describing the very thing I had started to feel, even if I hadn't admitted it to myself yet. I stood up, feeling an urge to leave that place as quickly as possible. But just as I turned to go, a rustling sound came from the nearby bushes. I froze, my eyes darting around, trying to pinpoint the source. The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I quickly backed away, never taking my eyes off the trees, and hurried back to the cabin with a growing sense of unease. That night, sleep was impossible. The forest outside seemed to come alive with every imaginable noise. Branches snapped, leaves rustled, and thudding sounds echoed around my cabin, each noise growing more insistent and rhythmic. It felt like something or someone was circling me, but every time I looked outside, there was nothing but darkness and the occasional flicker of shadows. The rhythmic pattern was unnerving. It wasn't random, felt deliberate, as if whatever was out there was making a conscious effort to keep me on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My nerves were frayed, and I kept jumping at every little sound. Unable to stay still any longer, I grabbed my flashlight and went outside, trying to trace the source of the noises. Shadows danced in the periphery of my vision, and the forest seemed to swallow the light from my flashlight, but nothing tangible appeared. The darkness was thick, and the trees looked like twisted, gnarled fingers reaching out to grab me. I went back inside, locked all the doors and windows, and sat with a kitchen knife in my hand, trying to stay as calm as possible. The sounds continued, sometimes fading away only to start up again, each one making my heart race faster. I could barely breathe, waiting for the sun to rise. Hours passed in a blur of anxiety and fear, the night stretching endlessly. When dawn finally broke, the noises abruptly stopped. Exhausted and terrified, I packed up my things as quickly as I could, desperate to leave. The claw-like marks I found around the cabin were too large for any local wildlife and made my skin crawl. I knew I had to get out of there before whatever it was decided to come inside. I left the cabin in a hurry, my mind still racing from the night's horrors. As I drove away, I could barely focus on the road. I headed straight for the nearest diner, hoping a cup of coffee and a conversation with someone might help ground me. In the dim light of the diner, I recounted my experience to an old-timer named Tom, who seemed to take a keen interest in my story. His weathered face grew somber as I described the claw marks and the eerie occurrences. After a moment of silence, he leaned in and said, "You've crossed paths with the Alani Skobzra." Tom explained that the Skobzra was a forest guardian, a spirit that fiercely protected its domain against intruders. According to local lore, it would create disturbances to scare off anyone who dared to enter its territory. The idea that my experiences might have been caused by something so sinister and ancient sent chills down my spine. I left the diner feeling more unsettled than ever. The Skogsra seemed like a legend, but the events I had witnessed felt all too real. As I drove back to the city, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, lingering just out of sight. The rustling of leaves and the eerie cries from that night continued to haunt me, even when I was far away from the forest. Years have passed since that night, but the memory lingers. The forest remains a dark, unsettling place in my mind, and the Skogsra is a reminder that some things are better left unexplored. Sometimes, as I lie awake at night, the rustling returns in whispers, ghostly echo from that unforgiving wilderness. I've learned that some mysteries are meant to stay hidden, buried in the depths of the forest, where the Skogsra prowls, waiting for the next unwitting trespasser. My name is Owen Matthews, and what happened to me on July 21, 2008 is something I'll never forget. That summer, I decided I needed a break from the daily grind of city life, so I packed up my old RV and drove deep into the Shasta Trinity National Forest in Northern California. Forest seemed like the perfect escape from the noise and chaos of the city. I found a secluded spot by a small lake and parked the RV there. It was a quiet, serene location with just me and nature. The first few days were exactly what I needed. I spent my time fishing, reading, and soaking up the solitude. Everything was peaceful and calm, exactly as I'd hoped. On the third day, I decided to explore deeper into the forest. I packed a backpack with essentials and set out along a faint trail that wound through the dense woods. The tall trees and occasional bird calls created a calming atmosphere, and I felt completely at ease. After a few hours of hiking, I stumbled upon a small clearing. In the middle of it stood an old, dilapidated cabin. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Curiosity got the best of me, so I approached the cabin cautiously. The door creaked open with a groan, revealing a dark, musty interior. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling and broken furniture was strewn across the floor. In the midst of the debris, I found a dusty journal lying on a table. The pages were yellowed and the ink was faded, but I could still make out some of the entries. They spoke of strange occurrences, people disappearing, and mentions of something called the Nara. I dismissed it as local folklore, figuring it was just another tale meant to spook tourists. With a shrug, I left the cabin and headed back to my RV. That night, everything seemed to shift. I was sitting outside by the campfire, sipping a beer and enjoying the serenity, when I started hearing rustling in the forest. At first, I thought it was just wildlife, but the sounds grew louder and closer, almost like they were circling around me. Then, out of nowhere, a piercing scream shattered the night. It was a human scream, raw with terror. My heart pounded as I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the source of the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, but I saw nothing, just the inky blackness of the forest. Called out, "Hello?" But my voice was swallowed by the silence. Panic set in. I was alone, miles from the nearest person, with no cell phone signal. I rushed back into the trailer, locking every door behind me. I grabbed a hunting knife from my bag, my hands trembling as I tried to steady my breath. The sounds outside continued, each rustle and snap of a twig making me jump. Sleep was impossible. The entire night felt like it was closing in on me, every noise magnified in the stillness. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching, waiting. When dawn finally broke, I felt a mix of relief and dread. I cautiously stepped outside to inspect the area. What I saw made my blood run cold. There were large, unfamiliar footprints around my campsite, prints that didn't match any animal tracks I knew. They were too big, too distinct, and too menacing. I tried to start my RV, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as I realized I was stranded. With no other options, I decided to hike back to the main road for help. Before leaving, I scribbled a note, hoping someone would find it and understand what had happened. The hike was grueling. Every snapped twig and rustling leaf made me jump, as if something was following me just out of sight. My heart raced with every step, and I quickened my pace, desperate to get out of the forest. When I finally stumbled upon another campsite, I was horrified by what I saw. Tents were torn to shreds, clothes scattered on the ground, and there was fresh blood smeared across the dirt. Nausea hit me hard. I forced myself to keep moving, the feeling of being watched growing stronger with each step. My legs felt like lead, and I practically ran the rest of the way to the road. By late afternoon, relief washed over me when I flagged down a forest ranger truck. Ranger Jane Lawson listened to my story with a mix of concern and skepticism. We drove back to my campsite together, but when we arrived, everything had vanished. Tents, the bloodstains, everything was gone, as if it had never been there. Jane's face turned serious as she glanced at me. "We need to get you out of here," she said quietly. Her voice trembled just slightly, adding to my mounting fear. Back at the ranger station, I spent a sleepless night poring over reports on the computer about any strange occurrences in the forest. That's when I discovered the chilling history of the Nara, a name that kept coming up in old reports of disappearances linked to this very area. The next few days were a blur of anxiety and sleepless nights. Despite the thorough search conducted by the rangers, nothing significant was found. No one could explain the strange events I had witnessed, and the forest seemed to swallow all evidence of what had happened. I returned home, but the sense of unease clung to me like a shadow. The name Nara haunted my thoughts, a mystery that remained unresolved. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was lurking in those woods was still out there, waiting for its next victim. I never went back to Shasta Trinity National Forest. The forest had left its mark on me, a stark reminder that some places are better left unexplored. The eerie feeling of being watched, the strange footprints, and the abandoned campsite, these memories continue to haunt me. Every now and then, when I'm alone in the quiet of my own home, I hear a rustling sound that makes my heart race. I know it's just my imagination, but it's a constant reminder of what happened. If you ever find yourself in a remote part of the forest and encounter something inexplicable, take my advice. Don't stick around. If you hear something you can't explain, leave. Because whatever the Nara is, it's best left undisturbed, hidden in the depths of the wilderness, waiting for the next unwitting trespasser. My name is Finn Connolly, and what happened to me on August 14, 2000, remains etched in my memory like a dark stain. I had just turned 30 and decided to celebrate by taking my new trailer for a solo camping trip in the remote wilds of Arkansas. I needed a break from the relentless hustle of Chicago, and Arkansas was recommended to me for its peaceful, untouched beauty. I found a quiet clearing beside a small, serene lake, surrounded by towering pine trees. It was exactly what I was looking for. The first night was perfect. I cooked steaks over a small fire, sipped a few beers, and listened to the calming sounds of nature. The lake reflected the starlight, and everything felt so peaceful and right. The solitude was exactly what I needed. I felt content as I settled in for the night, the warmth from the fire mixing with the cool night air. Little did I know that serenity would be short-lived. The next day, I decided to explore the forest. I packed a small backpack with essentials and set off along a rugged trail that led deeper into the woods. The forest was dense, with towering trees and the occasional bird call breaking the silence. I wandered for a few hours, enjoying the sense of isolation and the beauty of the untouched landscape. Around noon, I came across a small clearing that seemed perfect for a break. I sat down on a fallen log, munching on a granola bar and taking in the tranquility. But as I sat there, I noticed something unsettling. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an eerie stillness that made my skin crawl. I shrugged it off, attributing it to my overactive imagination, and started heading back to the trailer. The walk back felt longer than before, and the forest seemed to close in around me. Despite my growing unease, I convinced myself it was nothing and focused on relaxing by the fire that evening. That night, I tried to push aside the uneasy feeling I'd gotten earlier in the day. I settled down by the fire, grilling some steaks and enjoying a couple of beers. The forest was quiet again, but there was something about the stillness that didn't sit right with me. I brushed it off as just nerves. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a scratching noise coming from outside the trailer. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed my flashlight and peered out the window. It was pitch black outside, and despite the light, I couldn't see anything clearly. Scratching continued, rhythmic and persistent, accompanied by a soft thud against the side of the trailer. I grabbed a baseball bat from the trailer and stepped outside, trying to steady my breathing. The night was enveloped in darkness, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. I swept the flashlight around the clearing, but at first I didn't see anything. Then, at the edge of the clearing, I saw it. A tall, hunched figure with long limbs and a gaunt, animal-like face. Its eyes glinted eerily in the beam of my flashlight as it scratched the ground with long, claw-like fingers. Fear surged through me, and I stumbled backward, trying to get back inside the trailer. The creature, towering over me, began to advance. I bolted inside, locking the door and dialing 911 with trembling hands. The operator on the other end of the line tried to calm me down. I could barely get the words out, my voice shaky and filled with fear. "There's something outside. I don't know what it is, but it's trying to get in." She assured me help was on the way, but as I hung up, the minutes felt like an eternity. Creature continued its assault, scratching and pounding on the trailer, with a force that made the whole vehicle shudder. Its growls and snarls pierced through the walls, making my skin crawl. Every creak of the trailer felt magnified. Every rustle of leaves outside seemed menacing. I clutched the baseball bat tightly, my knuckles white. I could hear the creature sniffing and scraping at the trailer's sides, its breath hot and heavy against the metal. Just when I thought I couldn't take any more, the noise suddenly stopped. The silence was deafening. I sat there, holding my breath, straining to hear any sign of the creature. The minutes dragged on, and every little sound made me flinch. Finally, just as dawn began to break, I heard the distant sound of sirens. Relief washed over me, but the terror didn't fade. When the police arrived, I showed them the claw marks and the disturbed ground around the trailer. I told them everything. They seemed skeptical. They filed a report but said there wasn't much they could do. I packed up quickly, eager to leave the forest behind. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, and the memory of that creature's eyes haunted me. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't escape the nightmare. Every night was plagued by vivid dreams of that creature, its gaunt face and glowing eyes haunting my sleep. I spent hours researching local legends and trying to find an explanation for what I had encountered. The closest I came to an answer was a chilling story I found about a creature known as the witch. According to the legend, it was an ancient guardian of the forest, a being that prowled the woods to keep intruders away. Descriptions matched what I had seen. Tall, gaunt figure with long limbs and piercing eyes. The more I read, the more convinced I became that this was what I had encountered. I never returned to Acha National Forest. I kept my camping trips to well-traveled areas, avoiding remote locations. The memory of that night lingered, constant reminder of the dangers that might be hidden just beyond the reach of civilization. Even now, as I lay in bed, sounds of scratching and growling sometimes echo in my mind, a ghostly reminder of that harrowing experience. I share this story not to frighten you, but to warn you. If you ever find yourself in a remote forest and hear something that defies explanation, don't stick around to investigate. Sometimes what lurks in the darkness is better left undiscovered.